Good morning and welcome everyone. I'm Karim Mezran. I'm the director of the North Africa Initiative at the Rafik Hariri Center and the Middle East programs at the Atlantic Council. I would like to start off by thanking the Italian Institute for International Political Studies in Milan for their partnership with the Atlantic Council and making today's event possible. This event is part of a series of events that all tend to complete the intellectual theoretical passage towards the MENA dialogue that is going to be held in December in Rome from the 2nd to the 4th of December. And this is just one of the many events that lead to that biggest event that is going to happen at the end of the year. Our panel today will explore challenges of institutions development and reforms in the MENA region, specifically focusing on Tunisia, Libya, Jordan, and Iraq. We have 4 great experts. We have very short time, so I'll try to utilize it as much as possible by limiting the introduction and giving the word right away to one of our panelists. I'll make sure to have at least 20 minutes before the end for Q&A and questions from the public through our website. So we will begin our discussion today. I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Blower Al-Aldin. Dr. Al-Aldin is the founding president of the Middle East Research Institute, a think tank based in Erbil, Kurdistan region of Iraq. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Al-Aldin. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the organizers and everyone joining us. To stick to the topic, you may well be aware, those who watch Iraq, that we had an election in October 2021. This time was promising to be different, and it is different. But it has been 6 months since the election, and we still haven't got a new government. In fact, if anything, we reached a stalemate on breakthroughs on the power struggle between the alliances that are being forged. Now, there's nothing unusual about this. We've been here before. Every time after every election, it takes us this long to form a government. But this time, what is different is that we are still at the stalemate, and it could be another 6 months or more to form a government, if at all. We may end up with another election. The real issue is that in the meantime, everybody kept the federal Supreme Court, the court that is specialized in interpreting the Constitution. They've kept the court very busy, unusually busy, full-time, trying to interpret the Constitution and respond to all sorts of protests and appeals and allegations of violation of the Constitution. Now, this is a very good example of how not to do things. This time, unlike any other time, we cannot blame the regional powers, global powers, rivals who have been trying to influence our internal alliances and forming government. This time, it is the weakness of our institutions that are actually coming to the surface as independent factors of fragility. And they are exposing the entire system where we have failed over the last 19 years to translate the Constitution into state building, into a roadmap for nation building, for having strong institutions, and for having the contents of that Constitution implemented. As a result, we have 19 years of very slow and protracted process of state building that we end up with a lot of structural and functional gaps in our system of governance, very poor checks and balances that have actually in themselves have become independent drivers of further problems, further weakening of our governance, and further undermining the rule of law. As example, the very court that is now interpreting the Constitution itself has not been built as per the Constitution. Since 1958, we never had democracy, we never had a constitution. Now, it's been 19 years. We're trying to learn from scratch. One of the safety valves is that court that makes judgments, makes decisions on the constitutionality of everything we do after any election, all the way to our state affairs. So the very court itself has been accused of being more political and not based on the Constitution's articles, because we have not managed to form a court on that basis. Another very important filter, an important driver of state building is the Federal Council, the Senate style, the upper chamber that should have been there to guarantee that the parliament legislates for state building, that the executive branches would implement them, and then in the fullness of time with the judiciary and everybody complementing each other in building the checks and balances and building a modern democratic state. We do not have that upper chamber. 19 years after the change of regime and 17 years since the adoption of the constitution, we still don't have this kind of chamber that would have been a good filter to stop the parliament legislating poor legislations, bad legislations, or anybody violating the constitution. So violation has become a normal, everyday act that very few people are actually adhering to. So this sense or the culture of constitutionalism has not really evolved in a healthy way. So as a result of these, and we also should have been devolving power more away from the center. We have not done that properly. We do not have a good balance between the legislative branches and the executive. For example, the legislative branch, the parliament, it's on its own without upper chamber, and it's above everybody else. And it's actually capable of making life very difficult for the executive branch. Whereas conversely, we do not have a mechanism from the executive branch to dissolve parliament or to put parliament in check. So in a nutshell, all these things have led to even greater weakness in our governing system, in the rule of law, in the management of our resources, in the management of the economy, in the provision of public services. So everything remained weak, and the state is not functioning properly while we're not delivering what the voters expect. So corruption is rampant because the checks and balances are not enough. So it's not a surprise that we have protests like we had last year that brought down the government. We have radicalization. We have unemployment rising. We have all sorts of fundamental problems that very few governments can actually survive without tackling them. But for the first time, however, this time, unlike previous elections, we have some hope, because previously we end up with broad coalitions governing Iraq, where every party that had any number of seats in the parliament would join the coalition government. This time, we have a majority within the Shia components, we have a majority within the Sunnis, and we have winners within the Kurdish parties. These are coming together to go ahead with forming a majority government, but they're facing very stiff resistance from the others who are not necessarily first winners, as well as resistance from regional powers, especially Iran. And this is where we now are experiencing this clash between, or the battle of wills, where the coalition tries to form a government and push the rest to opposition, while the rest are not trusting the institutions of democracy that they have built themselves. They cannot trust it to protect the opposition and make a peaceful handover of power, and they do not feel like they would be able to survive the next 4 years in the opposition without being deleted by the ruling party. And conversely, the winners who are trying to win everything, they are going for winner takes all, and they cannot trust that they can win again if they give up this time. I'm going to end my intervention here and just say that this is an experiment that is not working, but we're trying, and Iraq is evolving, and we are on the right track for evolution. But you can see that the leaders, the onus is on the Iraqi leaders to build that state, build the institutions, and make sure that the institutions of power are empowered, strengthened to be able to make the transition from dictatorship to democracy successful. But unfortunately, what we have now, and that is my punchline, we still have the same old dictatorial centralized machine that is driving a shape of a car towards our aspirations, which is democracy. But trying to achieve democracy via a very centralized, very old style machine, it's not working well. So this is where we are, but I'll be more than happy to address any questions that may arise from what I have just described. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Al-Din. Very interesting, absolutely lucid, and I have many questions just for you. I forgot to say that one thing important. We chose these 4 examples as examples of transitioning from a dictatorship into a more open system, let's put it that way, at various stages of their evolution or involution, in order to have at the end some kind of an idea of where are the fault lines, what are the problems, what are the issues that have not been addressed. Is it the constitutional chart that is incomplete, is it well not done? Is it, as Dr. Al-Din said, the culture of constitutionalism that is not there? And if that is, how do you bring it upon the population? Or is there a fact that no matter what, you have to start going towards democracy, liberalism, pluralism, and there are bumps on the road and there are issues? Or these bumps on the road can be fatal? The topic seems academic, but it's fundamental. I think it is essential for the well-being of our peoples and for the idea that there is a right of every people to have freedom and not only culturally bound or religious bound issues. For this, we turn on our second speaker, which is Monica Marks. Monica is a scholar of Islamist movements, gender and politics in the Middle East and North Africa at the New York University in Abu Dhabi. Monica, what is, in your opinion, are the main challenges for the development of institution building, the same issue that we asked Dr. Al-Din in Tunisia? And what do these challenges indicate in terms of political transition and civil society participation, given President Said's grab of power? So within that context, if you can discuss this dynamics. Thank you very much, Monica.
Sure. I want to first mention a couple of competing tendencies in Tunisian political culture. Karim, you were talking about the question of whether some of the institutional challenges we're seeing across the MENA region are rooted in political culture, are rooted in the absence of constitutionalism. And, it's ironic, given the current state of affairs in Tunisia, given the extent to which Tunisia's current president is systematically unraveling the hard-woven, painstakingly woven fabric of democratic institutions that the country created through a very inclusive process after the 2011 revolution. It's ironic, given this current reality, that a central feature of Tunisian political culture historically has actually been Dastorianism in the best sense of the word, coming from the Arabic word dastur, which means constitution. Tunisia was the first country in the Arab world that had a constitution. A lot of its most important political movements, even political movements that were battling French colonialism before Tunisia became an independent state, were called the Dasturian movement or Dasturian party. So we have that on the one hand in Tunisian political culture. But there's another tendency, I think, that has competed with it historically, and that is Zaimism, coming from the Arabic word Zaim, meaning a leader who tends to have too much power or almighty power in some situations. And you can see Zaimism in Tunisia's political culture too. Habib Bourguiba, its first post-independence president, Ben Ali the second, and now again reasserting itself in the figure of Tunisia's president turned putschist, Kais Saied, who, though he was democratically elected in a landslide based on his anti-corruption platform, since July 25th, unexpectedly amassed all government powers in his own hands, in what effectively amounted to a presidential coup. So we have these competing tendencies, and you can see them playing out today. Unfortunately, today, since July 25th, since that presidential coup, Zaimism, I think, I would argue, is taking more of an active role as people in a time of immense crisis, where they had a lot of legitimate grievances, grievances with a paralytically underperforming parliament, grievances with socio-economic deprivation, grievances with the failure of the Tunisian states in its 11 years of political transition to meaningfully reform its corrupted and corroded security sector, for example, the failure of the state to create a constitutional court, etc. Frustration with all of these paralyses and various failures, combined with the COVID lockdowns, which had very classist, disproportionate impacts in Tunisia, combined with the rise in inflation and economic troubles, primed the population for Kais's presidential putsch on July 25th and have primed the population for looking to the role of the Zaim more and more. Unfortunately, that has boded very dangerous things for Tunisia's nascent fledgling democratic institutions, which were created after its 2011 revolution. Of course, number one in those institutions, I'm just going to kind of go down the list here of democratic institutions in Tunisia that are being systematically destroyed, obliterated, even in some cases right now. Number one, the Constitution. President Said's presidential coup on July 25th was anti-constitutional, even though he tried to justify it through a poor reading of Article 80 of the Constitution. It was an illegitimate anti-constitutional coup. Since July 25th, the Constitution has effectively been a piece of paper that has no bearing on political reality. Since that date, all decisions have been made through presidential decree, through rule by fiat, with zero effective checks and balances on those presidential decrees. Number two, the parliament. On July 25th, President Kais Saied forcibly shut down Tunisia's democratically elected parliament, put military tanks in front of its gates, and instituted sweeping travel bans on every elected parliamentarian, not only in the current parliament, but in every parliament since 2011, all three of those parliaments, and not only targeting his critics, but targeting all parliamentarians, even in parties that were initially enthusiastic about his coup. So parliament has been a dead letter. Number three, the media in Tunisia, the institution of the media. Tunisia's media has a very strong reflexive muscle memory of dictatorship. As you can imagine, to become a journalist in pre-2011 Tunisia, you probably weren't going to be terribly interested in that profession if you valued speaking with a clear evidence-based voice. So Tunisian media is it's a weird hodgepodge now in post-revolutionary period of a lot of old regime muscle memories and reflexes and people, human resources, and a lot of newer blood too. And we can see that playing out. Tunisia's media, a lot of it has been self-censoring, operating in lockstep with the new Zaim since July 25th. Patches of it have not been doing that though, and it's interesting to see that war playing out within the media. Number four, Tunisia's judiciary. One of the great failures of the transition in Tunisia was the failure of various parliaments to create a constitutional court, a Supreme Court effectively. So that means that when President Said did his presidential putsch on July 25th, there wasn't a good, Supreme Court or judiciary to effectively overrule him. The closest thing we've had in Tunisia to a judiciary is something called the High Judicial Council, which is a body that governs judges' appointments, career paths, etc., and ensures their independence. It was the last safeguard of judicial independence in Tunisia, and earlier in February last month, Said obliterated it, and is creating a new High Judicial Council, basically that's completely under his authority. Pillar number 5, democratic institutional pillar number 5, civil society in Tunisia. We can see a similar war playing out in civil society between legacy civil society institutions like Tunisia's famous Nobel Peace Prize winning quartet that won the Nobel in 2015 for successfully negotiating a route through the 2013 barter crisis that almost sunk Tunisia's transition then. Those organizations include its famous labor union, the UGTT, the Bar Association, the Human Rights Association, etc. Those legacy organizations, sadly and ironically, given their Nobel Peace Prize, have tended to be more receptive to Kais Saied. They were initially very enthusiastic about what happened on July 25th. Their main criticism since then has not been of his end goals, i.e. rule by presidential fiat and dictatorship. Their criticisms have been his means, the how, the fact that he's not doing his dictatorship in a consultative way, the fact that they are not present at the table. So in effect, they've been kind of waiting by the phone for the proverbial presidential ping, which has not clearly come yet, although UGTT and Saied have been in more conversations. So the possibility that some of these groups like UGTT, which is could really make or break Saied's coup, move more definitively into his camp if he starts to meaningfully dialogue with them, is there. It's real, and that's something to watch. On the other side, with civil society, you have newer civil society groups created since the revolution. Some of those are clearly against the coup. Others are having very pitched, heated debates within their steering committees between people who are more versus less sympathetic. All of these different institutions are being threatened. You know, in some cases, like the High Judicial Council, Constitution, the 2014 Constitution and Parliament, totally obliterated. In other cases, like media and civil society, on the chopping block, very much on the chopping block. I'll just take one last minute here to say that an effective resistance across ideological coalition resistance against Kais Saied has not yet emerged. As I wrote about in a piece for Dawn published last month, the opposition is fragmented into about 3 different pieces. Polarization is the main reason why. A lot of political parties, civil society organizations, etc., that come out clearly and call what Kais did a coup, which now pretty much all political parties in Tunisia have done that, even the ones that were initially sympathetic. A lot of those still, they don't want to work with Ennahda, Tunisia's center-right so-called Islamist political party, because they don't want to be thwapped with the reverse Midas touch that Ennahda seems to bring. Ennahda is a very polarizing political party. For some justified and some unjustified reasons, it has been the focus of a lot of people's rage. It was also the victim of decades of political propaganda under Bourguiba and Ben Ali, calling it a terrorist movement, basically. So there weren't deep reservoirs of trust in Ennahda, and a lot of folks don't want to work with it. And that's the main reason why an effective opposition that's unified to Kais Saied, that can protect these democratic institutions, hasn't emerged. Lastly, the best case scenario for Tunisia right now is that it gets back on a constitutional path, that it gets back on a path that's in keeping with the 2014 constitution. That would mean not following Kais Saied's roadmap. Saied proposed a quote unquote roadmap. I don't think that word really applies. It's more of a pathway to or freeway to consolidated authoritarianism that would involve a referendum this summer that would allow him to basically implement a more authoritarian constitution in Tunisia to replace the democratic inclusive 2014 constitution, etc. Tunisia needs to be detoured from that referendum. But again, an effective, coherent, unified opposition coalition has not yet formed to do that, to safeguard these democratic institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. Excellent presentation. So, in fact, you're saying that even though there is, in theory at least, a constitutional culture in Tunisia, because of the fact that it goes back to the late 1800s, on they're all been talking about Dustur, no-Dustur, etc. That was central to the building up of the Tunisian, both the opposition and the anti-colonialists and so on. they had elections, fake, real, but still people went out and that. But despite this culture, despite the very inclusive, as you said, and I agree, one of the best ways to draft a constitution has been done, undertaken by the Tunisians. So despite that, that tool, the chart, has been utilized in its having created three different heads: the president of the parliament, the prime minister, and the president, has been utilized by the strongest of these three figures to abolish it, to change it entirely, to modify the trajectory of the thing. So what is the point of having another constitution now? What is the point of centering the debate on the constitution or constitutionalism, or having seen that even in Tunisia, which is probably the one where this constitutional culture was more developed, it hasn't worked. Where at the last moment, all it took was a note from the palace, and everything collapsed.
Do you want me to respond to that right now, Karim?
No. You
Okay,
think
sorry.
about it, and we
Sure.
come a second time.
I would say
Because the same approach
very
I would like to
important right
ask.
now. Yeah.
I would like to ask it to Dr. Aladdin. The same debate. What is the central now is, do we waste our time on the constitution that anybody can destroy rather than in building a different culture or whatever? Or should we continue to persist in creating the legal framework and trying to build the institution that can help constraining the forces into that? Now we talk about the easy and happy part of the world, Libya. We have Tarek Mejir, the Senior Policy Fellow with North Africa and the Middle East Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations, where we focus specifically on Libya. Tarek is not only a very good friend, but one of the analysts on Libya that I esteem and value and trust much more today. So please, Tarek, go ahead and give us your ideas about this issue, or the constitutionalism and the institution building in the homes.
Thank you very much, Karim, not only for these very kind words. I hope I live up to the billing now, but also for the interesting conversation that's happened already, and I'm going to try and play into that here today. But yeah, thanks for inviting me to be here. It's really an honor to speak at one of these events, let alone to be on such an esteemed panel as I am today, and let alone to speak about a topic like this, about institutions, the interplay between governance and politics and so on, because it's frankly a topic that's very close to my heart, because as boring as it might sound to others outside of this sphere, institutions are the vehicle of governance, and it is governing incompetence on the other side, this inability for governments of the region to care for their populations, to enable them to live with dignity, to support them in manifesting their ambitions and aspirations. It's these basic failures of what governance is that triggers so much of the frustration, the anxiety, the anger that fuels the revolutions and all the popular uprisings that we've seen across the region. And as you'll know very well, Libya is not so different in that regard. If there is one word you could choose to describe how Muammar Gaddafi ruled the country for 42 years, it would be chaos. And that's the word that a lot of Libyans also use. He ruled largely without institutions. He often created extra legal mechanisms like revolutionary committees and so on, or kind of transient institutions which lived, or which had a lifespan only so long as they were useful to execute any particular policy. There was no normalized structure in place for developing policy and for steady everyday governance in that sense, which could carry out the life cycle of a policy from inception to delivery and to maintenance. And this is something which, of course, had long-standing effects on the country's governance capacity. I mean, you could make a pretty good argument to say that, Gaddafi came to power in 1969, and Libya as a nation state has been in a slow motion collapse in terms of the state's capacity to provide for its people and to grow and develop alongside its people since since perhaps the late 1970s. And it's been a refrain because of all of these things that I've mentioned. It's often been said, especially since 2011, that Gaddafi left Libya as a land without institutions. And it's something which I kind of wish was true, because then, we would have all just had a blank slate on which to start, which is, something quite cool, quite novel, and which is actually far easier to work with than the reality of the situation. Because despite all of this, the ministerial structure, the institutional structure of the state did exist. It just, as I said, wasn't used for creating policy. It was used for providing public sector jobs. It was used as a mechanism for paying salaries and for keeping people busy, for the sake of being busy. So we not only have institutions, we have institutions that employ a majority of the population of the Libyan state, and we have institutions already there, already in place, which have to be used, but which are designed to not only be unproductive, but to be counterproductive. And so it has been very difficult, even after the revolution against Gaddafi, to be able to create functional governance in the country, which is one of the reasons why it stalled. The major challenge of state building, before Libyans and before all those working on Libya, is how to build new institutions whilst preserving and slowly dismantling the old institutions, because the old institutions are largely unworkable. But at the same time, you can't leave 80 odd percent of the country without a paycheck overnight. And that's a relatively unique challenge, and something of a Gordian knot. But to play into some of the conversations that have already been happening, governance and institutions and all this, it's not just about mechanics. It's also about mindset. It's about political culture, and there's a link between governance and politics, right? It's this sense of politics is people's understanding of how things work, how the state's supposed to work, what the state's supposed to do. And the political side is the how of all this works, the legal rule books for how to structure and how to operationalize that popular understanding and those popular expectations of the state. It's, as I said, it's the how of how governance would ultimately work and deliver, all these things that I opened this talk about. And so, whilst there is no constitution, there is no kind of basic rule book for how these things are going to work, then it's impossible to almost build plans or to build strategies for how to deliver these issues, how to build new institutions. You need that foundation upon which to build. And there is an interplay, Karim. It's not about only having a constitution or only working on a culture or only working on, that ground level governance issue, how to build capacity of line officers and so on. It's an interplay between all of that. And underscoring all of this, which is especially relevant in the Libyan sense, is that there's a need for that cultural shift or that understanding of what politics looks like. And that more profound shift, despite Gaddafi being killed and the revolution being performed more than 10 years ago, still hasn't taken place in Libya. You can say that you have power if you force somebody to do something, if you can force people to live a certain way. But Gaddafi, over 42 years, he cultivated true power, which is the sense that he framed out in most of his population's mind their entire understanding of politics. Their view of politics and how political systems work is still largely Gaddafi's view. People's understanding of politics from the level of the parliaments to the levels of the street is still what Gaddafi called a jabahariya. And this is a sense of kind of an internal competition that Libya is not the sum of the parts, it's just the different parts. And they must all compete with one another to gain access to public funds, to the state itself, and to seek to dominate that state. And so whilst everybody still views politics in this very confrontational way. There is, in a sense, a culture that pushes towards conflict, that breeds insecurity, because you never know which community, which group has the kind of dominant access to the state. And so without having this profound shift towards, notions of equality of citizenship, that all Libyans are exactly equal, they will have the same rights, the same benefits, the same obligations, in essence, a new social contract of national rights and obligations. Until that can be established, then I think that a lot of this insecurity that drives conflict and which also drives corruption will exist to kind of confound any attempt to make constitutional change or to make functional change. And the shift from centralization to decentralization is perhaps the perfect example of this. It's something in Libya that was picked upon immediately. Many Libyans said, after 42 years of hyper-centralization, of dictatorship, we want to move beyond this. And we believe that we are safest and most empowered under a decentralized system. And so over the last 10 years, we've seen this kind of battle between local communities who want to decentralize as much as possible and those at the heart of power who want to preserve that power. And that's just, one example of some of the conflicts that you get without this clearer idea of how everything is going to work, which ties us back into the constitutional level. And perhaps in that slightly muddled and convoluted way, I think I managed to go full circle quite well on the interplay between, your governance, your institutions, how that works, constitutionalism that underscores all of that, and the political culture which drives people towards shaping that constitution and which gives those institutions their raison d'etre and how they're going to function in the first place. And because we're talking about Libya, I'll underscore and I'll end everything on a slightly pessimistic note that, and I should say not for the sake of pessimism, but just to belie the reality of the situation, is that Libya has been stuck for the last 10 years. And has been unable to form a constitution, has been unable to have these conversations about a new social contract, about a new relationship between its state and its people, because of the legacy of that hyper-centralization, because of the legacy of that Jamahiriya mindset and the corruption which accompanies it. Today we've had 2 elected parliaments, both of which are still in power. Today, there are once again 2 governments in the country, none of which make any effort to govern the country. And they justify themselves and they legitimize themselves on largely parochial claims to their various groups that they are representing them because they will provide them with the largesse of the state, because they will provide them with employment in the public sector and so on. And whilst this situation remains, and without any kind of outside force to provoke some new change, it makes the prospects for any improvement quite dim. There is little appetite for forming the constitution, despite how much politicians seem to talk about it as a way to avoid elections or any more profound change. But thank you very much, Karim.
Thank you, Tarek. Practically, Libya is the example of a pre-political constitutionalism culture. We are in a moment in which there is no idea of what a constitution would work with, because there has not been a common understanding of the mission, of the institutions, of the future, of the nature of the Libyan state. So it is really at a how I say, building up of institutions. It has to be built up, the constituency, the people have to, but otherwise, as you said, we are always going to have 2 governments, each one justifying it according to local output or input or generic pseudo-constitutional claims. Very interesting. Thank you very much, Tarek. You gave us a lot of food for thought. The Italians say dulcis in fundo, the sweetest at the end. So, Samar Mohareb, Samar is the CEO of Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development. She focuses on political and social reforms in Arab regions, specifically in Jordan. Samar, to conclude with possibly some nice thoughts. The recently approved constitutional amendments may have an impact on Jordan's political system and the institutional balance. What does this indicate in terms of political transition and civil society participation? This is the general. Then, of course, address the issues that you prefer to. The floor is yours, Samar. Thanks.
Thank you, Karim. Thank you for your kind remarks and for this interesting discussion. As much as we think and we believe there are common constraints around the issue of institutionalizing any sector, the public sector, the private sector, and for sure the civil society, it's very evidential that each country has its own constraints, has its own context and barriers and opportunities as well, if we may say. To start with a positive note, this discussion is coming in a unique time, at least for Jordan nowadays. We are hearing more and more invitations for public dialogue towards institutionalization, towards reform in the public sector and the private sector, which led to a serious efforts from the government and the kingdom in general to initiate huge reform projects. We just ended, as you indicated, the political reform project, which introduced massive constitutional changes towards main issues or main problems that we were facing. The other positive note, I would say, is the willingness of the country to not only to look at the constitutional constraints as an isolation from the economic barriers, the economic issues, and the social, let's say, problems that we are facing. That's why the king himself has been criticizing our institutional capacity. So what I wanted to say that there is more openness, at least, to talk about these issues in public domains, in media, in official media. All government officials, they are repeating what the public is saying about the lack of trust in all institutions in Jordan. Recent, let's say, studies and surveys is confirming that there is a huge lack of trust and a gap of understanding on the role of the institutions that we are expecting to have in Jordan between providing public services or shaping policies, or at least taking the lead on fundamental decisions that is impacting Jordan. Saying these positive changes which occurred after Corona or during the last phase of Corona, still we have serious issues we have to address towards our institutional capacity in all sectors again. In Jordan, unfortunately, the main fundamental challenge towards institutionalization is the instability situation, the lack of stability in the macro level. Our country is subject to a huge impact due to the realities around us. A country is having 16 different camps, 16 refugees camps in Jordan. A country that its all borders is surrounded by conflicts, and the main conflict, which is the Arab-Israeli struggle, which is putting lots of constraints on our abilities to think beyond. Given these realities at the camps, massive institutions such as UN agencies or NORWA mainly, which is the UN agency that's leading the support on most of these camps, the 13 Palestinian camps, which are residing in Jordan for the last 70 years, it's receiving a huge pushback from the international community towards its funding, towards its ability to sustain its main services, which should trigger a main threat for Jordan host community and Jordan governmental, let's say, institutions. What's coming? What's the future? What are the scenarios that we are expecting? That is enforcing a huge priority on all of us, which is the security agenda, which is prioritizing our economic decision, prioritizing our civil society, let's say, agendas, programs, what we are trying to do for responding to current needs, and at the same time keeping in our mind the future situations and scenarios. On top of that, there is as well many introduced laws and regulations constraining our abilities to have a specific level of independence towards what is needed, towards what are the requirements. For instance, financial transactions between the banks and all of these institutions. Many laws were introduced in the last 10 years after the Arab Spring toward money transactions to sustain the abilities of these organizations or the institutions. At the same time, again, I will go back to the independence level. Many of the organizations, starting with the parliament as a main institution, they're lacking the ability to move away from this common security agenda that the government is enforcing on top of us. Leading to the civil society situation, which for sure it's one of the most impacted sectors within these realities. In Jordan, we have around 6,000 civil society organizations, local civil society organizations. Recent studies we did in support with other UN agencies and international agencies showing that there are only 80 organizations is having partnerships or are having sustainable income or sustainable funding that would enable them to do the minimum, let's say, expected duties from them. From these 80 organizations, only 5 organizations, they are having a budget of $1 million and above. And this is a sad reality. So we are talking about a very fragile civil society that is trying to cater on so many fronts, sometimes taking the responsibility of the government in catering so many services, so many essential, let's say, needs towards our community, especially the refugees response and the corona response that had a big impact on our abilities to think beyond these immediate needs. In the same time, we are keeping our eyes on these reform projects, how we can engage. And as Dr. Monica indicated, in Tunisia, for instance, the civil society is struggling between the how, what's going on, how we can situate ourselves, how we can be on these tables, at the same time, how we can cater and satisfy the needs of our communities and the immediate needs we are facing. And I think it's not the how that we are just want to be on the table, it's just like these are the realities and we are trying just to push the agenda forward. Maybe this reform would happen, this reform would have a positive impact. So let's support, let's try to be complementing player to the table. But unfortunately, we know that there are so many barriers, and the main issues we are facing in this is the funding, our financial, let's say, abilities, how much we are subject to the international, let's say, support towards our countries. And it's not a secret that Jordan's main source of impact is the international support that we are receiving as government institutions and civil society and other related sectors. So this lack of sufficient independent resources, sufficient independent civic space, that is putting a toll on our abilities to continue. And here we can ask about what are the roles and responsibilities towards institutionalizing? What is the role of the state in terms of having modernized, let's say, laws and regulations to enable the space for flourished capacity, institutional capacity? What are the requirements in terms of ensuring effective public-private dialogue as well to engage the private entities and the private civil, let's say, agents in these dialogues, and how we can ensure their equal representation for everyone, including refugees, including other, let's say, targeted, let's say, beneficiaries or societies which try to bring their voices to the table. At the same time, we have to look at the responsibilities of the societies themselves to be mobilized regardless of the funding, despite of these challenges, what we can do to enhance the situation. Most of our youth are surrendering to the new trends in the development and the humanitarian sector, the usage of technology, the role of innovation, how we can be using the social media to represent our needs. But we are neglecting the authentic requirements for community mobilization, how we can organize ourselves and to have official, let's say, relations with the government, official relations with this public sector that would take us more serious, and we enhance our presence in terms of numbers and the quality. Again, civil societies are, in my view, and everyone agreed on that, that it's a main pillar for ensuring transparent governance structures and better social contracts in the region. We have to pay attention to what are the needs towards that vision, and to have a very big, let's say, a trust in the ability of the people themselves, that they are the main pillars of the required change. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I have it. Thank you very much, Samar. Excellent, excellent. Now we've got a bunch of questions coming from the public, from the audience. The first one is for Dr. Al-Din. Is the Iraq judiciary taking a more active role in the current government formation process? What are the prospects of these institutions' more significant participation in future elections? Dr. Al-Din.
Yeah, sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
Yes. Is the Iraq judiciary taking a more active role in the current government formation process? What are the prospects of these institutions' more significant participation in future elections? Centered on the judiciary.
Yeah.
Its role,
Yeah, I think the judiciary is always kept busy around about elections and formation of government, but this time unusually so. The court has been seen really in some ways, people would like to see it as a guarantee of protecting the constitution or implementing it in a proper way, but actually it's also seen by others as a tool to be used by major forces, including regional powers, to stop certain things, certain processes. So essentially, many accuse the court of being highly politicized. Of course, courts in our region are politicized, but when it is used as a political instrument to progress certain pathways and prevent others, then they become a center of attention. The court in the previous setup, up until last year, there were 9 other judges there. They were known to be conciliatory, moderate, trying to please everybody and not to rock the boat. Whereas this group of judges are slightly more assertive, they are more bullish, and they enter territories that are very controversial. And because their decision is supposed to be binding, there's no way of appealing against what they say, they've taken full advantage of that. So there are many areas where their own statements is not necessarily constitutional, yet they have gone into those territories to overinterpret the constitution, giving themselves power to prevent certain things, to abolish certain things, or to even improvise as we go along. So essentially, we're lucky to have this court. At least we have a source somewhere that people actually go back to. But actually, when it is so highly politicized, or its decisions are perceived to be politicized, that's when we have a problem. And of course, I mentioned earlier that the court itself is not founded or not formed, not established based on the Constitution. The Constitution dictates that there should be a court with certain specifics, certain criteria. We've never had that, and we're unlikely to have that for some time to come. So everybody's now using the court to, one way or the other, to prevent their opponents from doing certain things, or to block the entire process altogether. I want to mention to address one of your key questions that you asked after my intervention. That is whether the Constitution is good or bad. Is it actually a symptom of the Constitution not being good, or is it constitutionalism and rule of law that is not being there? Everybody agrees that in Iraq, the Constitution is not perfect, but it is good enough to be a roadmap. If everybody tried to implement it, at least for a phase, for like a decade or two, rather than focus on its deficiencies, focus on actually enacting or translating it and legislating for all its articles. There are well over 60 legislations that are mandated by the Constitution. They should have been by now formed, developed, and enacted. they are not even debated. And then quite a lot of others that are legislated for, they are not enacted. It's the government, the executive branch, being selective in implementing it or not. So everyone who is involved in the branches of the governance, whether they are legislators, executives, or judicial, they all violate the constitution with no consequences. And that is where we have a problem of, instead of attacking the constitution, let's have this actually a transitional one, taking us from where we were and the dictatorship and a structure of governance that is designed for centralized authoritarianism. Let's go towards democracy bit by bit in phases and milestones rather than dismiss the entire constitution. The constitution needs revision. It has to be revised, but it shouldn't be done before we have tested it to its limits, that we have actually implemented it and learned from the mistakes, as well as identifying the gaps that are in there. So we are now in a phase where we should be getting our institutions empowered, putting them in place, the checks and balances, before we move into radical ideas of saying the constitution should be rejected.
Okay, thank you very much, Radin. Very clear. Thanks a lot. We are running a short of time. I have maybe two questions. Monica, what is the influence of international actors on the Tunisian institutional reforms? And could the international alliances of President Said condition this process?
When you say, did you say condition this process?
Yeah, let's say, what is the influence of international actors on the Tunisian institutional process, if there is any? And the second, could the international alliances of the president conditions the process?
The two main players that really matter for Tunisia's democratic institutions have been the US and the European Union, especially the bilateral relationship with France. I think both actors were, we could talk all night about post-2011, but I'll just focus on post-July 25th. I think both actors were initially in wait-and-see mode after July 25th. But as Said started to bite into chunks of more and more of that democratic institutional fabric, I think they started to get nervous, especially the United States. I think right now they're trapped between waiting kind of ineffectually and being nervous. They want to put pressure, but they're not exactly sure what types of pressures to put and what kind of positives and incentives they could give. Said is having almost no dialogue with any international actors right now. So the levers seem to be limited. I think some pressure was put on Najla Bouden, his prime minister, but she doesn't have any meaningful power. And it's not clear how much Said even listens to her or regularly dialogues with her. So there are no clear levers, really. I think there's a hope on the part of figures in the US and European Union policymaking circles that Tunisians will kind of, wake up from this inaction and come together in a unified coalition of some sort, or that Said will backtrack, or that he'll be reasoned with somehow. But, unfortunately, like I was saying, I don't think we see much positive motion there. But, at the end of the day, if Tunisians are going to save their political institutions, it's going to be up to Tunisians, as it should be.
Thank you very much. One last question I have is for Tarek. What are the main flaws of the UN approach to Libya's institutional reconstruction? Has the Libyan political dialogue forum model failed? In 4 minutes.
Well, if we talk about UN flaws in terms of institutional reconstruction, I could do it in under 4 minutes, because I'm not actually aware of a UN approach to institutional reconstruction. The UN have focused almost entirely since 2014 on the very thin political elite, which kind of sits on top of everything. And it's usually focused on creating an elite bargain. So this misguided belief that if you can get all of those who have foregone governing the state in order to steal from it, to create an agreement between them on how to organize that looting of the state in a sustainable fashion, then it would create some form of sustainability and a platform on which to build political change. That's been the underlying kind of UN mission and international approach more generally towards Libyan politics. And so unfortunately, alongside this, you've had NGOs looking at trying to rebuild institutional capacity, and it's been kind of bit part policy making, which is not tied to any wider or broader approach to the country. And so, yes, unfortunately, we end up, as you say, Karim, and as we saw in this, almost like that American movie Groundhog Day, where we just go around in circles looking at the same attempt to form an elite bargain between the same group of elites. In the meantime, Libya degrades more and more, the state fails more and more, the quality of life decreases more and more, and the people suffer more and more. So, yeah, unfortunately, this is the major flaw.
On this note, I would like to thank you, all of you. You have been great. It's been a great panel. A lot of food for thought. I hope that our public, our viewers have enjoyed as well. Thank you very much, Samara, Dr. Al-Din, Monica, Tarek. You've been great. Thank you very much. I hope to see you soon in person somewhere or again in one of our events. Thanks a lot for everyone.
Thank you so much, Karim.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. No, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. You have been great.